All right, thanks, Ash, and thanks, colleagues. So once again, now with technology hopefully helping me, good morning, dear colleagues in the region, and good evening to Alicia, Honorary Judge Robert J. Torres, and Sarah, who join us from US and Canada. I'm very pleased we gathered for this knowledge exchange session, and a special thanks once again to our colleagues from the National Center for State Courts, who have kindly agreed to share their experience with us, also at this late hour in their time zone. We have quite an interesting agenda of us ahead of us, so a very brief introduction before we move on. So as many of you know, my name is Thomas Kvadaras, and together with Sarah and country teams, we are working on the regional initiative called JIN ASEAN, or Judicial Integrity Network, which is funded by the US Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, and which works in 7 ASEAN countries: Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Again, as most of you know, project's objective is to provide technical support to network members with an aim of enhancing judicial integrity and court excellence through various activities such as peer-to-peer exchange, regional workshops, learning events, research, and self-assessment tools. So one of those self-assessment tools, particularly IFCE1, is the topic of today. Some country offices are currently implementing the self-assessment, and the others plan to do so with their respective national partners in the near future. And we wanted to shed some light on this exercise from a prominent entity, which is also one of the founding members of the International Consortium for Court Excellence, and therefore who have actually launched the self-assessment itself. So today we have colleagues from regional country offices, and I want to double check if our colleague from Tajikistan is here. I'm not seeing her. Maybe she'll join later because I see some colleagues are joining. Anyhow, so we'll open the floor for introductions and questions in the second half of the session. But right now we'll start with our main presentation. Alicia and Honorary Judge Torres will present the background and key elements of the international framework for court excellence. They'll also share some regional and country experiences, in particular judicial ethics survey in Malaysia, which will be followed by a more interactive Q&A part where I encourage colleagues to share their experiences and ask questions. And we'll wrap this up, well, Sarah will wrap the session up with insights from the presentation and discussion and next steps for JIN ASEAN. So without further ado, dear Alicia and Judge Torres, I'll give the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas. I'll go ahead and get us started. I'm Alicia Davis with the National Center for State Courts. I'm a principal court management consultant. I've worked with the National Center for the last 12 years. I've done most of my work within the United States, but I've also had the opportunity with the international framework to work in Latin America, the Caribbean. And then as we'll talk more about, I had the great pleasure of working with Justice Torres in Malaysia prior to the onset of COVID, so about 4 years ago. So we'll talk a little bit about that experience, and we'll talk about the application of the judicial ethics assessment. My great pleasure to introduce Justice Torres. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of Guam in 2004 and has served as the Chief Justice for several terms. And as you may know, Justice Torres, he has extensive experience working in the region, and he continues to be in close contact and works in an advisory position with the International Consortium. So Justice Torres.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just give me 1 second here. Got to make sure that I give me 1 second here. All right, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't muted and I wasn't seeing the controls. Good afternoon, at least where I'm from, which is in Guam. We like to say Guam is where America's Day begin. And when I lecture in the US, I like to tell them it's tomorrow in Guam, so that makes me a man of the future. But many of us in the Asian countries are on the same time zone, so we can't say that exactly here. But clearly for those in the US, it gets a rouse out of them. I've had extensive experience in presenting on the International Framework for Court Excellence through countries all over the world. I've actually been to every country who's part of the JIN Asian beneficiary countries except for Laos. I've, of course, been to Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. In fact, back in 2017, we worked with the Philippine judiciary when they were examining, looking at their strategic performance management system, which they call SPMS through their civil service on output based efficiencies for, and it had a number of cycles, and we worked with them utilizing the international framework for court excellence. I'm also familiar, and I, as you know, when I get involved with doing something, I try to educate myself as much as I can on what is ongoing. And I'm familiar, at least with the judicial excellence to ensure justice for all, the JIN Asian network, including looking at the overview and some of the beneficiaries and the partners and the objectives, and the including the budget and the project management arrangements. I'm also familiar, of course, with the judicial integrity self-assessment checklist that was developed with the IFCE and the UNDP. My understanding is that a number of the beneficiary countries are in the process of already undertaking that self-assessment tool. Alicia, I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to go through the PowerPoint and just and I don't know if you want to just control it. We can just skip over this and go through the next item on the agenda that's there. I mean, I was going to, and I don't know how much all of you are familiar with the International Framework for Court Excellence. I am on the International Center for Court Excellence, which is the part of the consortium that is put together the framework back in 2012, really, and then our first publication was in 2013, and it's been updated twice. Most recently, we did an update to the framework back in 2020, right, basically almost at the beginning of COVID. And the third edition of the framework, which was released in 2020, looked at emergence of new developments in the legal landscape, the increasing use of technology, the greater adoption of alternative dispute resolution. We put some more emphasis on ethics and codes of conduct. We also expanded the area of court excellence on court workforce, recognizing that human resources is the most valuable asset that any court has. And we had to have greater recognition and emphasis on the role of the court workforce. We also introduced a new set of recommendations on court technology, and then sort of combined the self-assessment questionnaire and the self-assessment checklist, which either one could use before, and sort of combine those to look for more of a simple tick and score approach. We also, because of the volatility that occurred with the courts with a result of COVID-19 and the pandemic and a number of the changes that were implemented, we also had a organization, meeting and presentations to some of our members and various courts, and we had a large attendance indeed from Indonesia in March, and we looked at a variety of topics that would have been of interest to the partners of the ICCE. I mean, we looked at how we could meet the challenges that are coming up for the workforce development for tomorrow's courts. I mean, you know, people have gotten accustomed in some respects to doing teleworking or working with various schedules. We looked at how we could embrace the new modes of court operations, because many courts were sort of forced to develop new operations as a result of COVID. And then, of course, the change management in highly volatile and uncertain environment. How are you going to manage change? What some of the issues are for courts on change management, and you know, what's the best way that you could have a successful change management program? Because ultimately, as the UNDP and GenAsian undertakes these projects in each of the courts and develops court improvement plans based on the assessments, and looks to develop an implementation plan, which Alicia, I mean, if you're familiar with it, we'll go over it a little bit about the constant improvement cycle and the court improvement cycle. You're going to have to manage that change, and if you're not careful and prepared to how you're going to manage the change, including evaluating who your detractors will be, because there definitely will be detractors. And there will be the naysayers, but it's how you do it. And then, of course, we also wanted to figure out, and another thing that we did was how you can harness public trust and confidence in what we hope is the endemic world, as opposed to the pandemic world. But, you know, public trust and confidence is critical to an independent judiciary and to, you know, going forward. Then the other thing I wanted to, you know, you can see here, this is kind of the roadmap of where we were. We launched it really in 2008. We did the first publication, though, of, and then the second was in 2013. And then we had a second edition of the global measures in 2018. And we actually have now got a third edition of the global measures of court performance, which was released in 2020. And those, there are 11 global measures that look at, you know, different tools and look to core performance measures of courts, court user satisfaction, the fees, the access fees, the case clearance rates, the processing of the courts in terms of time standards, looking at pretrial custody. Pretrial reform is very important, you know, in many jurisdictions, innocent until proven guilty. And there have been a number of pretrial reform efforts that have been undertaken in various jurisdictions to evaluate pretrial custody. And then, of course, it's something that's not unfamiliar to many of us, but continues to be, at least with my perception, problematic with many courts, is the court file integrity. And then, of course, backlog, certainty of trial dates and completion, the court employee engagement, compliance with the court orders. What do you do? And procedural fairness, also very important to, you know, research has shown that even though people may not be successful in matters before the court, that how they are treated in a court goes a long way towards their acceptance of a court's decision and compliance. So, you know, and then, of course, evaluating the cost. We can't have justice be unavailable to them. You know, that's kind of an overview of how I've been involved with, and, you know, some of the global measures for court performance. and the framework. Alicia, can we just jump to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just want to see. So that, these were some of when the consortium initially got started, there was a perceived absence of court-specific methodology for promoting excellence. It was in the business world, there was, these excellent models that businesses were able to use to evaluate their performance, but there wasn't something that was specific to the court. And so we felt that when we were developing the framework at the onset, that we should have our own quality framework methodology. Communities have long seen courts and the benefit to social order and the stability of a process where you can resolve disputes amongst their members in a non-violent manner. And in some jurisdictions that was done with chiefs or groups of elders. But over time, almost every country has developed their own systems of courts with various models. And courts, I think, are relied upon as the institutionalized and independent process for dispute resolution. So we have a unique place in the system of government and in terms of deciding disputes and resolving the disputes. And while there are differences that vary across courts, throughout the world, in the method of the way their officers are appointed, in their jurisdiction, in their funding, in their processes and procedures, what I think almost all courts have in common is the principal function to try to adjudicate matters impartially, fairly, on the basis of the rule of law, and in a way that is going to be binding. And so, while courts perform this function, though, there's a much broader role that they have to play in the community. And decisions in individual cases can have and do often have, especially when they involve other branches of government, an impact on the broader community. And so there's been a lot of pressure on the courts, particularly with their performance. And oftentimes there was a recognition that courts would be somewhat secretive. Because of judicial independence, we would not have accountability or transparency. But I think we have seen that society, most recently, the media, the people, they expect accountability of government, and the courts are no different. So we have to be accountable for our performance, and we have to be accountable for the manner in which we expend our money. And I think that is where the framework sort of came in. And initially, a lot of courts had what they called KPIs, key performance indicators, and they were numerical, quantifiable, but they were somewhat a crude reflection of the performance of a court. They didn't really provide insight into the complexity of the caseload or guidance on the progress of cases. And so the initial reaction of courts, especially when they were looking at performance measures, was to sort of have set up a wall. They were concerned that it was going to be a misjudgment of their performance. It was going to adversely affect how government allocated money to them. And so, there was a apprehension to look at it. And so what the framework did was try to look at quality management, and that, workload doesn't reflect necessarily the performance of the court or the quality of justice that they dispense. And so if you're going to say there's a high quality in a court's business so that they're delivering a quality of justice, what does that mean? And that's what the framework saw as its challenge. And that's why we decided to come forward and produce this international framework for court excellence. And we use excellence really as quality because we wanted to show it was a very high standard. the highest level of standard that people would expect. And I think that through that, we have sought to capture the unique character and the role of the courts. And the consortium, if you don't know, has a list of core values that are generally accepted as common to all the courts. Alicia, I don't know if you have the core values there, if you pull that up.
I do.
The core values, you know, basically, and it doesn't matter really whatever court you go to, these are core values that I think people generally accept as common, and that, you know, there'll be equality, you'll be treated fairly, there's impartiality in decision-making, the independence of decision-making, you won't be unduly influenced by outside sources, competence of the decision makers, the integrity, the transparency, the accessibility, it has to be accessible, the timeliness, and the certainty of your decisions at some point when the decision is implemented, and, you know, particularly in there's appeal process, that it's certain. And these values really provide the backbone for a proper functioning court and set the very highest level of integrity and performance. So when we're talking about the pursuit of excellence, these core values underscore your court's performance, your court's functions. And if you have excellence and adherence to these court values, it's going to clearly reflect excellence in your performance more generally. If you don't adhere to these values, you're going to have a considerable challenge ahead of you to secure the confidence of the community and even your own officers and staff that you're performing your role in the manner that is expected. So another thing that I want to emphasize before going on to discussing the next slide is just to let people understand that one of the great strengths of the framework at the onset is that the court is in charge of the process itself. You know, the court decides how to use the framework, the manner in which it's undertaken, and the control over it rests with the implementing court. And so that is something that I think that you have to do and end up deciding and how it gets utilized. Now, there are 7 areas of court excellence, and you can go to that. You know, we talked about the core value, and these are the areas of excellence. Court management and leadership, the first one, which is the driver, is really pivotal to achieving court excellence. You need proactive and effective leadership and strong leadership to help implement the recommendations. And whoever the leadership that is in charge has to believe that in these changes and convince his judges and the court administrators that those changes are necessary to attain court excellence. And one of the most challenging aspects of this is challenging the mindset of the judges and the staff. Many of them are adverse to change and wants, you know, just used to the status quo. And of course, because status quo is the easiest. But if you get them on board and you get their cooperation, your changes are going to be well received. And, you know, it's natural for people to be apprehensive of change. Of course it is. So you need change agents to help you work through that. The second are the systems and enablers that are there. You have the strategic court management, the court workforce, the court infrastructure, and proceedings and process. I'm not going to touch on detailed explanations on all of it, but the court proceedings, the infrastructure proceedings and processes, for example, you know, refers to the need to have fair, effective, and efficient court proceedings. You know, you have to take pride in dispensing justice expeditiously, but at the same time, without compromising on the quality of justice. And so, you know, you can look at various ways in which you can come up with differentiated case management styles, time standards, a number of things of that. And then the last is the court, the results that you get. You know, you have the driver, you have the systems and enablers, and then you have the results. and its court user engagement, the affordable and accessible services, and public trust and confidence. I'm going to talk just about the public trust and confidence aspect. The framework notes that if a high level of public trust and confidence in the judiciary indicates successful operation of your courts. If you have a public that believes in the judiciary and understands the judiciary, you are going to have a well-functioning judiciary, a judiciary that will have the public trust and confidence of its members and be able to follow the decisions of the court. Ultimately, you have to have the respect of the judiciary as an independent tribunal and a fair and impartial tribunal. And also you have to have acceptance of the court decisions. And if there's public trust and confidence, if they understand the process and understand what's going on, you'll go a long way towards ensuring compliance with your decisions. So Alicia, is there anything else? So that's an overview of essentially the framework. We, like I said, we updated the framework in 2020. I told you where were the areas that we expanded on the framework from the second edition that was released, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about it. But in a nutshell, then the framework was done in an effort to look at a quality management tool specific to the judiciary that was seen to be lacking. And the consortium, which was the founding members, were the Australasian Institute of Judicial Administration, the Federal Judicial Center, the National Center for State Courts, and the State Court of Singapore, and with help from the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice and the World Bank and Spring Singapore. One thing I think, just putting this out there, understanding that the assessment, the Gymnasium assessment checklist is being utilized, self-assessment checklist, maybe in some of the countries. I think in terms of when those results are obtained and looked at, I think at least I feel I can be most helpful, particularly with my experiences in a number of different countries and the implementation of the improvement plans, help identify the areas for improvement based on the self-assessment surveys, and help come up with court improvement plans specific to the courts that are in the process of undertaking that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alicia to talk about the continuous improvement methodology.
Thanks very much, Justice Torres. So we want to continue this as sort of an interactive discussion, and in order to help us understand a little bit where you are in your usage of the international framework, we thought it would be helpful to actually apply the framework. So as you all know, this is a quality improvement methodology that it consists of these various areas that I'm sure that you all have experience in working with. And so just as when we are conducting a workshop in which we're asking the countries or the court system to consider where it is that they are and where they eventually seek progress, this is the analysis and this is the process that we go through. So first of all, assessing the current condition and establishing a problem statement, then gathering all available data or the applicable data to better understand the nature of the problem, the root cause, some of the contributing factors, then taking a look at that plan of improvement that Justice Torres was talking about, putting that into place, ensuring that there's a really good communications mechanism, and then evaluating progress according to the metrics that you've determined. And Justice Torres talked about the global measures, and we'll make sure that you have a link to that in the chat here. So So keeping that in mind, we'd like to go through an exercise where you are considering the country or the jurisdiction that you're working with. And we'd like you, we're not going to ask you, we're not going to volunteer or call on anyone necessarily, but we will invite you to share anything that you would like to. But we'd like to ask you for the jurisdiction that you're working with to conduct this exercise. If you would first develop the problem statement, then identify the data that you would want to access to give you better information about the problem, then considering some of the strategies that perhaps are under consideration already, and then considering how you'll measure that. So so we're going to give you a couple of minutes to think through this on your own, and then if you have a piece of paper or if you want to write this down somehow, and then, like I said, use that as the basis of conversation. Let me give you an example based on a court that I recently worked with and am working with to develop a plan of improvement. So what you see here, you may be familiar with. These are the National Center for State Courts model time standards, and they exist for all areas of law. And the court that I was working with was looking particularly at their felony criminal caseload. And as I'm sure is the experience for many of the courts that you're working with, especially coming out of the pandemic, most courts are very concerned about their backlog and the fact that meeting a model standard like this, where 75% of felony criminal cases are expected to be resolved, like adjudicated, taken care of within 90 days, is impossible right now for many courts. And so this particular court was taking a look at their backlog status and their time to disposition, and they were finding that most of their caseload is sitting at more at about 400 to 450 days. And even that isn't terrible, but it's something that they definitely want to improve upon. And so in working with them, my slides are a little slow. So the problem statement is that their cases are at more than 400 days, that they seek to come more into compliance with those model standards. Some of the data that they're collecting right now is that they want to know what's happening with the filings, with the new charges that are coming in from the prosecutor. During the pandemic, the prosecutor was holding back a lot of cases. They're finding that they're having a really hard time getting criminal defendants into treatment, that their staffing is really low right now, which is slowing down the processing of court papers. And they're wondering what the difference is between each of the judges' courtrooms. How quickly are there courtrooms that are keeping up with those time standards better than others? So one of the solutions that they're considering is this Pathways project that helps to identify. It's a grant that comes through Human Services, and that it offers participants, especially if they're low level criminal offenders, it gives them the access to some different services and rehabilitation, like alcohol and drug treatment. And they're thinking that could really take away a significant part of their caseload. And they're also planning on meeting with their board, with the local community, to discuss what their goals are. Are they really focused on timely adjudication of criminal charges, or are they really trying to reintegrate parties into the community, which they recognize takes longer and may require more services? So I just wanted to work through that problem statement as an example. And then, like I said, if you could all take a moment and think through the courts that you're working with and that you hope to apply the international framework, if you could just take a couple of minutes, and I'll time it for 2 minutes. And if you could just jot down your answers to these different dimensions. Let me know if you have any questions. You can either ask me or you can drop it into chat. Any questions right now?
while they're doing that, not I noticed in going through and just reading about the different projects that were being undertaken and the timetables that had been laid out, a number of them had looked at some of the self-assessment being done. I think it was July through October timeframe. I don't know if that's still the time frame that's being examined, how many of the countries were actually undertaking the self-assessment, Asian self-assessment checklists, and when those results might be compiled, you know, for purposes of identifying and looking at some of these areas, because the self-assessment obviously is very important. And it has to be, you know, that establishes the benchmark kind of against which you plot your future progress and look at how you're going to be done. And, you know, you want to try and involve as many judges, administrators, and court staff as possible, so that ultimately when the plans are developed, they end up owning part of it and have a role in implementing it. So I'd be curious to hear about that after we get through this exercise, since you're looking at developing the precise problem statements. And
Thanks, Justice Torres. So let's give you just another minute or two to think of your problem statement.
I see Keita from our Laos country office is asking which country is the data.
Yes, so this would be you're looking for, probably you're looking for data from the country that you're working with. Sometimes you can find data from another jurisdiction that could be helpful. But let's say, for example, like with the example that I gave, that this particular jurisdiction is looking to improve their time to disposition for their felony criminal cases. So their most serious criminal cases. So in that example, they would be looking at their time to disposition rates for individual judges' courtrooms, as well as they'd be looking at time to disposition for the court as a whole. Does that answer your question? Well, there's a little bit of an echo.
Keita, if you can hear me, maybe there's more than one computer turned on with the session.
With the data from, so the user suggested. So I'm wondering if now we are working in LPDR, but sometimes it's difficult to reach the data. So and then I felt a little bit difficult to reach that level to allocate the data or develop the action plan at your quality.
I believe what I heard you say, Keita, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, correct me if I'm not, is that it can be very difficult to get data at that level. And either by the courtroom or, yeah, absolutely. That is a challenge that we experience on a regular basis. Sometimes it's not so much that you are saying, yes, I have the data right now in my hand, and I'm able to perform this analysis. By creating you can only get to the answers if you have a really well-formed question. And so I've heard many people that I've worked with in the application of the framework talk about the importance of that precise problem statement. And so asking the question in a really good way, it's by identifying the information that you need that you can start to gather that information. And it may be pretty simple at the beginning. So to say time to disposition, you may realize that, okay, so we need to get better about capturing our incoming cases and then knowing when cases have been resolved. So even if you don't have the data today that you need, don't let that stop you from identifying that those are pieces of data that you need in order to be able to inform the nature of the problem, as well as to be able to say that this is something that we're improving in. The time to disposition is one of those global measures that helps to inform how well the court system is working. So I know that that's doesn't solve the problem, but hopefully additional thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, the IFC, as far as I understand, this is a continuous improvement methodology. So yes, we can try to obtain data through the integrity something.
Exactly right. Thanks for raising that issue. Any other?
And I think that in looking at this additional data, it's important, I think, when considering if you don't have some of the data that you might need or feel would be important to assess the problem, it gives you the opportunity then to look at collecting that data in the future, if you feel it's important. And then also, how are you going to measure? I mean, it's important that when you're looking at the improvement cycle, one of the things that you've got to be able to measure your progress. And so if you don't have the data that is going to help you measure the progress, then you have to evaluate, well, how else are you going to measure the improvement? If you feel that some of the data that you have isn't going to be available to you to evaluate, then either find a way to collect the data or look at other indicators that will help you measure your performance and your improvement. Because ultimately, the self-assessment provides the benchmark, and then goes forward, to looking at, based on as you develop the problem statement or the areas in which you can improve, and how you're going to go about analyzing, evaluating, implementing, and then measuring it.
Sure.
And then Ashvinder brought up a really good example of a problem statement and of a very frequent problem, saying at present, X percentage of persons accused in court do not have legal representation. Ash, can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you present that as a?
So it's very much rooted in an access to justice issue.
Mm-hmm.
So in Malaysia, we see, while very frankly, a lot of rich and famous people can afford the top lawyers money can buy, but there are also numerous cases where people, in the last 2 years, with COVID, a lot of people have had their economic circumstances pressed, and some of the poorest members of societies have unfortunately resorted to stealing everyday food items from grocery stores
Right.
to feed their family. And these cases come up to newspapers, and they're reported that an unemployed man stole milk powder. Or stole rice, a packet of rice from a grocery store, and they were charged in court, and they have no representation in court. So they were sentenced very swiftly for these crimes. So I think this is an issue that's come up a lot in Malaysia in the last few years with the pandemic.
Absolutely. And it's in the example that I gave, that's a jurisdiction here within the United States, but we're having the exact same issues. People being brought in for stealing 2 bottles of water because they, don't have housing, and they find themselves in that situation. And so one of the things so you gave the example of people needing legal representation, and certainly that's true. And then people also needing, one of the solutions here, or one of the issues here, is people needing supports like housing and food and that sort of thing. And so trying to address, absolutely, that's a great problem statement. And so, you could say you could establish a goal of increasing attorney representation, and then some of the data perhaps did you think about some of the data that you would want to collect to understand better?
At the moment, I'm not familiar with how this data is stored. I think the best, well, one way to know is to check with the Bar Council here in Malaysia on how much free legal aid were given in the last, say, 2 years. And then check separately with the court about how many cases have come to them in the last 2 years. So I could see what's the percentage of free legal aid. I think that would be one indicator.
I mean, those are
Absolutely.
perfect examples of data that you feel would be important to help you understand the problem and assess it. I mean, is this a particular problem? And as you evaluate the jurisdiction, is this just a problem in KL? Is it a problem that exists in rural communities? You know, is it and understanding you know, I think accumulating that data will help you understand and further develop, you know, what the problem really is. Is it confined to particular courts? Is it more? Is it countrywide? And then also, you know, what would you do to, and is there something else you need to get other data that besides, as you indicated, the percentage of legal aid, the number of cases that have occurred? Is there data from independent third parties, for example, that show the poverty level decreasing, that shows that over the last 3 years, the poverty level has increased significantly. So there's going to be, and poverty is driving some of the decisions that these litigants these defendants are making and choosing, you know, their course of action and alternatives, maybe programs that might be available. So there's a lot of different information when you really start thinking about it in the context of a simple problem as, you know, legal representation in courts for these type of issues that can help you assess the problem and help you look for solutions to the problem.
I see, is it Somani? Did I say that correctly? Has her hand raised?
Correct. Yes, hello everyone. You know, my name is Somani Sihatev. I'm program analyst, work together with Keta, you know, so that's why we are planning to conduct the workshop for the court next week. So, you know, based on our plan, you know, we will have the first, you know, we will introduce the IFCE, and then we will walk them through, you know, to understand on this framework. And of course, we are going to have the self-assessment. So my question related to this, you know, because what, for my understanding, you know, with that self-assessment, we will ask to help the court to identify their own problem. And then we will ask them to identify what the problems or the priorities that they want to improve. So with that, we hope to put in the, you know, to help them to develop the action plan. So, so my question is, you know, when you talk about the identify additional data, so I'm just thinking if we have to do another additional, you know, data collection, or if it's enough, you know, to do the self-assessment and the court already identify those problems, and then we can go to the, you know, identify programs and go to develop the action plan for them. So that's my question. Thank you.
Justice Torres, do you? Yeah.
Yeah. So Mani, I think that the self-assessment helps you evaluate the areas based on the self-assessment that's undertaken. You are going to prioritize the areas that you feel need improvement. And usually when we look at it and we look at the self-assessment, I try to get people to think about short-term, long-term, and mid-range plans and improvement, because not everything, there's some improvement plans that can be implemented immediately. There are others that are going to take more time to develop when you do it. And so the self-assessment helps you sort of identify and prioritize the areas in which you will need to start what I call your journey to becoming an excellent court. And it's a continuous journey. And there's, constant changes that are going to have to be made. So that helps you at the onset. And then when you develop the areas of improvement, the areas in which you want to improve and prioritize them, looking at short-term, mid-range, long-term, then you can go forward within the development of those short-term, long-term, mid-range areas of improvement. Identify, is there something else you need that you want to look at specifically to that problem? Like the self-assessment might have been able to identify the problem that Ash had pointed out in terms of not having an increase in self-represented litigants or pro se litigants in the court, or people in criminal cases. And even we have something called a civil Gideon, even in some civil cases like landlord-tenant law, where people can't afford legal representation. So the self-assessment tool might have helped you get that problem, identify it, realize that's something you have to address, but it might not have helped you identify, for example, those additional data that you might want to collect later or from third parties. So the self-assessment tool is specifically designed to help set the benchmark against which the court is able to plot its progress towards excellence. And it's to look at areas for improvement and then agree upon a plan to address those deficiencies or areas in which you can improve upon.
So I see that we are actually coming very close to time, and so I wondered, so what we had hoped that we could begin to communicate today, and perhaps we can continue on, because and we can send you some information about our previous experience when we worked in Malaysia and their application of the framework. We can make available to you the PowerPoint that we shared with them and the report that was conducted, and we're available to answer any questions that you have about that. What we had hoped to do today was to begin conversation about best practices in applying the framework, and some experiences. And Justice Torres talked about, has all of the experience of working with various countries, and talked about some of the amendments that had been made to the framework in recent years, and then in light of the pandemic. If you have any other questions, specific questions that we can respond to now, I think one of the main issues, or one of the main things that we've addressed today, is talking about the data that's needed. One of the things that we really struggle with at the National Center for State Courts is just the availability of data, and having good information to manage the cases and the resolution of cases. The backlog issue is a real concern for so many courts, and the problem is that they don't have, courts are really working to develop greater sophistication with data. And without that, it can be very difficult to resolve some of those issues. But we're continuing to, work with various courts to brainstorm steps and strategies to address the problem. So I know that we've really just scratched the surface today, but I wonder if anyone has any specific questions for today. So let's see. So more guidance and advice on what we can do for best proceeding this work will be good for us. Yeah, I'd like, Justice Torres, you and I talked about this last week. I wonder if you could say a word.
As I mentioned, I think at the onset, and in terms of, I went back and I looked at a number of the projects that are being done, like, for example, in Vietnam, and the timetable for execution of improving judicial integrity in Vietnam in line with the international standards. In Indonesia, how they're going to want to maximize their SWAS system, and looking at the international framework in in Lao, wanting to build in judicial integrity and expertise in digitization, and having improvement of the international framework, the understanding by Laotian judges, and working through it, and the timetable that was there. And then of course Thailand as well, looking at their building of judicial excellence to judicial transformation. And I think, quite frankly, I mean, with the self-assessment in JNASIAN, and we've already worked with them, the framework has, and with the self-assessment tool, and if that's being implemented, where I see an ability to really collaborate more on and work is when the self-assessment tool is done, is looking at developing and supporting the implementation plans that are based on the self-assessment tools, and then looking at the evaluation of those self-assessment plans. So really it's helping develop, it's helping analyze, what occurred when we get through the court improvement cycle, and then getting towards the really helping these courts with experience and in a number of jurisdiction. You're doing the assessment part, helping them analyze it, and then developing these plans for implementation, and then helping evaluate it. That's where I really think the value will come from, at least my continued participation, just because, and it's from courts of all levels. I mean, from the trial court to the appellate court, and small rural courts to city courts. I mean, it doesn't matter. I think I've had the ability to do that, and I'm happy to. It's a short hop. I mean, I've been to many of these countries. I'm really in America, but I'm Asia in America. So I'm really Asian, and born and raised on Guam. I'm a Pacific Islander, and I know the culture and the people of this region. And the Agong in Malaysia is a good friend of mine. We go back many years, and so I think ideally I'm happy to do this work just because I am very passionate about it, and I want to see these countries succeed, these judiciaries succeed in implementing the rule of law. And I plan to be around for many more years in Guam. I'll be the Chief Justice again in January. Again, I'll be taking the helm of the judiciary. And so I really think that the contributions that the National Center for State Courts and the international framework can do, working with JNASIAN and the UNDP, to look at ensuring that the implementation of the international framework for court excellence in this country ends up being a success. Because ultimately that's what we want it to be, and I think we can do that by helping these courts, and in developing it. It's not going to come from the outside in. Clearly, I mean, I'm not going to come there believing, oh, here's the right way for you to do it. No, that's the wrong approach. It really has to be built through the collaboration and the work of the people in each of those jurisdictions, because that is what's going to make it work. It's not going to be work by outside experts coming in and telling you this is what you have to do. You have to work, and that's the hard work. The hard work is when the self-assessment is done, is evaluating the results, analyzing it, and developing the implementation plan. That's when you've got to roll up your sleeves and understand. And there'll be many areas you could identify for improvement, but not all of them are achievable, and some won't be achievable even short term. So it's deciding, prioritizing what you feel is realistic and what you can do, and then developing those plans.
Well, Justice Torres and Alicia, I'd like to thank you both very much on behalf of JNASIAN. And Justice Torres, we all heard your offer, and you might be regretting making that to all of us, or you might be going on a tour. But it's a really wonderful offer to, as in each country, people are thinking about how to use the self-assessment checklist in a slightly different way, reflecting, as you say, that the culture and leadership within the judiciary, to also be able to learn from that expertise in the region. I'm just going to make a couple of short comments to close out by just a few observations about some of the ideas that have been shared here, and then announce a little bit of good news and next steps. But I really appreciated the comments you both made here around recognizing that the self-assessment is a tool of change management. And I think that's an important observation for us all to have, that it's part of a bigger process. It's not something that once it's finished is sort of a complete finish and we don't have to think about it anymore. It's a tool for having conversations about judicial integrity, about judicial excellence, and shifting that conversation a little bit. I appreciated Justice Torres' comments that it's critical that judges really own and run the process. And I think that really fits with Jen Azian's commitment to being a peer-to-peer network of building up the capacity of judges and judiciaries across the region to learn from each other. And then Alicia's both comments and also the exercise she had us going through to really think about the importance of data to understand our problem statements, even the data we don't have yet. And I think we all feel like that a little bit, where we know there's questions we wish we could understand more. Even articulating what that data is that we're looking for helps us to start to get closer to that. And then offering that support. And I love the parts of the chat where you're already offering that support to each other. This is the first time that people involved in each of these initiatives have been able to get together and sort of see each other and know who's at the same stage of this process. And we hope to do more of that, to be providing some of this quiet background support as you guys are using the self-assessment checklist and then implementing action plans. Which takes us to the good news. The US State Department, it funds Jen Azian and has approached us about extending the scope of funding for this phase of activity by an additional year. So that means we are in a position where you guys have done a lot of great work to get these projects off the ground. And for the 4 projects that are up and running, the 4 that Justice Torres just summarized, we'll be developing an option where if those deliverables are met in the first 18 months, we'll have extra funds to support exactly that implementing of an action plan that he pointed out is the key step to success. There'll be some funds there. It also means that some of the countries that aren't currently running a Jen Azian funded project will have an opportunity to propose something through this extension. So hopefully that's good news, that we can get a little bit more life out of all of the work that you're doing. And you can know that so long as we're staying on track on these deliverables, we'll have a way to support one more stage of that implementation. I want to also announce a couple of really quick things that are going to happen more immediately this fall. The first is that Jen Azian is partnering with International Association of Women Judges to continue to raise the importance of gender threats to judicial excellence, both affecting judges themselves and how judges respond to issues of gender equality in the courtroom. And so we'll be co-sponsoring a virtual event in January or February. Watch for that. I know a number of you have gender equality as a big part of the process for your self-assessment. And so this will be an opportunity for you to profile that for judges working in this area. And then secondly, we're launching a gender working group. That'll be a small group, sort of by invite only, having judges who are already champions on gender issues to meet and support and talk about how to better support judges across the region. So if right now, as you're doing the self-assessment in the workshop you're in tomorrow, or Sony, whoever else is meeting a judge who's a real champion around gender issues, just make a note of them, tell us who they are. Don't ask them right away if they want to do this, because we want to make sure that the working group has a good mix of people across the region. So let us know if you've got a judge in mind, and we might come back and sort of invite them to participate in that. And then the last thing to tell you about is that we're going to start doing a bit of planning about what Gymnasium should look like next, where we should go next. And that strategic planning over the fall includes hearing from you about what you think is most useful about Gymnasium, where you think we should focus going forward. So keep that in mind, and I'll be sending you a really short survey to give some input into what you think the future of Gymnasium should look like. And we'll be doing that in the month of October. So gendered threats and judicial excellence, still high priority over the fall. Thank you all for your inputs into the process that you, in terms of approving those last bits of the report that's coming out in the next little while. Let us know about your gender threats champions or your gender issue champions, and watch out for the strategic plan. It's going to help us shape where we spend that more money to better or to continue to support your work implementing these action plans. And again, very grateful to Alicia and to Justice Torres for sharing your insights and making that offer to continue to support the learning and the experimenting of this community as we stumble through this together.
Thanks so
Thanks
much.
very much for the opportunity. And sorry we ran out of time. We'll be sending you some materials.
Yes,
It's always
absolutely.
good
That's what I
to-
wanted to mention, that we'll be sending the PowerPoint presentations and we'll be doing some sort of paper based on what has been mentioned, but also including the experiences from actual implementation. So it's going to be some sort of living working document where you can see how colleagues are doing, what lessons learned they were. And again, thank you so much for, I believe this is beginning of this relationship, and not to over abuse the availability of Alicia and Justice Torres. We'll be reaching out regarding various aspects of the self-assessment. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day and rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.